Carol, go find another spot. This one's for blood family, not adopted children. My sister's voice rang out across the restaurant, loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire table erupted into laughter, their eyes landing on me like I was some kind of punchline. I stood there, frozen, holding my glass of water while my cheeks burned with humiliation. It was supposed to be a nice family dinner. Instead, it turned into a nightmare I'd replay in my mind for weeks. My name is Carol, and I'm 27 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, working as a project coordinator for Northrise Apparel, a mid-sized clothing company that specializes in sustainable fashion. I've been with the company for 3 years, and I genuinely love what I do. The work keeps me busy, the people are kind, and the paycheck is decent enough to let me live comfortably in a small apartment downtown. But none of that mattered when I walked into that restaurant 2 weeks ago. My family had called me out of the blue, inviting me to dinner at an upscale Italian place I'd never been to before. I thought it was strange at first. We weren't exactly close. My adoptive parents, Janet and Howard, had always made it clear that I was different. I wasn't really their daughter, not in the way that mattered. My sister Natalie was their biological child, and she'd been treated like royalty since the day she was born. Growing up, I learned to accept my place in the family. I was the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit. Janet and Howard adopted me when I was 4 years old after they'd struggled to conceive. Then, 2 years later, Natalie came along, and everything changed. Suddenly, I became invisible. Birthday parties were smaller for me, Christmas gifts were fewer, and every accomplishment I had was met with a polite nod instead of genuine pride. Still, I tried. I worked hard in school, got good grades, and stayed out of trouble. I thought maybe if I proved myself, they'd see me as their real daughter. But it didn't matter. Natalie was the favorite, and I was just the kid they'd taken in out of obligation. So when they called me for dinner, I was surprised. Maybe they wanted to reconnect. Maybe things were changing. I showed up at the restaurant that night with a small flicker of hope, thinking this could be a fresh start. I was wrong. The restaurant was beautiful, with dim lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. The table was already full when I arrived. Janet and Howard sat at one end, Natalie and her husband Kyle at the other. There were also a few cousins I barely knew, along with an aunt and uncle who'd always treated me like a stranger. They were all laughing and chatting, wine glasses in hand, completely absorbed in their own conversations. I smiled and greeted everyone, taking the empty seat next to Natalie. That's when she turned to me with that cold, fake smile she always wore. "Actually, Carol, this seat's taken," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Why don't you sit over there?" She pointed to a small chair at the far end of the table, wedged between two cousins who didn't even acknowledge my presence. I felt my stomach drop, but I forced a smile and moved. I wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. The dinner went on, and I sat there quietly, picking at my food, while everyone else laughed and talked about things I wasn't part of. Natalie dominated the conversation, bragging about her new promotion at work and the vacation she and Kyle were planning. Janet and Howard beamed with pride, hanging on her every word. No one asked me how I was doing. No one cared. Then, just as dessert was being served, the waiter approached the table with the bill. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed Janet and Howard would take care of it, like they usually did for family dinners. But instead, the waiter walked straight to me and placed the leather folder right in front of my plate. I stared at it, confused. "Excuse me," I said, looking up at the waiter. "I think there's been a mistake." He smiled politely and shook his head. "No mistake, ma'am. The bill is for you." My heart started pounding. I opened the folder and nearly choked. $3,120. For a table of 10 people. I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked around the table, waiting for someone to say something. waiting for someone to laugh it off and tell me it was a joke. But no one did. Natalie smirked, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. "Well, Carol, you said you wanted to be part of the family, right? Family helps each other out." Janet nodded, sipping her wine. "It's the least you could do after everything we've done for you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands trembled as I held the bill, my mind racing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the folder in their faces and walk out. But instead, I took a deep breath, reached into my purse, and pulled out my credit card. I smiled. "Of course," I said calmly, handing the card to the waiter. "Happy to help." The waiter took the card and walked away, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Natalie looked almost disappointed, like she'd expected me to break down and cry. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. As I sat there, waiting for the waiter to return, something inside me shifted. I realized that I didn't owe these people anything. They'd spent my entire life making me feel small, making me feel like I didn't belong. And now they wanted me to pay for their overpriced dinner like I was some kind of ATM. But I had a plan. The waiter returned with my card and a receipt. I signed it, thanked him, and stood up from the table. "Well, it was lovely seeing everyone," I said, my voice steady. "I hope you all enjoyed your meal." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Leaving so soon?" I smiled again, this time with a little more confidence. "I have an early morning tomorrow. Busy week ahead." As I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my arm. I looked down to see Natalie gripping me. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait a second, please," she said, her voice low. I pulled my arm away gently and met her gaze. "What is it, Natalie?" She hesitated, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt? Regret? I wasn't sure. But whatever it was, it disappeared just as quickly as it came. "Nothing," she muttered, letting go of my arm. "Just be careful." I didn't respond. I just walked out of the restaurant, my head held high, knowing that this wasn't over. The days following that dinner were strange. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind, over and over again. The laughter, the smirks, the way they all looked at me like I was nothing. I'd spent years trying to convince myself that I didn't care what they thought, that their approval didn't matter. But deep down, it still hurt. I'd been adopted when I was 4, after my biological parents died in a car accident. I barely remembered them. All I had were a few hazy memories of my mother's smile and my father's laugh. Janet and Howard had been family friends, and they'd offered to take me in. At the time, I thought it was an act of kindness. Now, I wasn't so sure. Growing up in their house was like living in a constant state of limbo. I wasn't unwanted, but I wasn't truly wanted either. I was just there. A placeholder until Natalie came along and filled the role I was never meant to have. Natalie was born when I was 6, and from that moment on, everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't the center of attention anymore. I was the older sister, the one who was supposed to set a good example and stay out of the way. Janet and Howard doted on Natalie, buying her new toys and clothes while I wore hand-me-downs. They took her to dance classes and piano lessons while I stayed home with a babysitter. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself it was normal, that parents just had favorites sometimes. But as the years went on, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. Natalie's birthday parties were extravagant, with dozens of guests and elaborate cakes. Mine were small, quiet affairs, with a store-bought cupcake and a card. By the time I was in high school, I'd learned to stop expecting anything from them. I focused on my studies, got involved in extracurriculars, and saved up money from part-time jobs. I wanted to prove that I could make something of myself, even without their support, and I did. I graduated near the top of my class, earned a scholarship to college, and landed a great job after graduation. I built a life for myself that I was proud of, a life that didn't depend on them. But no matter how much I achieved, it was never enough. Natalie would always be the golden child, and I would always be the outsider. Still, I kept trying. I showed up to family dinners, sent birthday cards, and called on holidays. I thought that maybe one day they'd see me as more than just the girl they'd taken in out of pity. But that dinner 2 weeks ago shattered any remaining hope I had. I thought about Natalie's words as I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the receipt from the restaurant. $3,120. I'd paid it without hesitation, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. The truth was, I could afford it. My job paid well, and I'd been careful with my money over the years. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they'd humiliated me, treated me like I was less than human, and expected me to smile and take it. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Over the next few days, I started thinking about what I could do. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to hurt them or make them suffer. I just wanted them to understand what they'd done, to feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused me. And then, an idea started to form. I'd always kept my professional life separate from my family. Janet and Howard knew I worked at a clothing company, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know that I'd been promoted twice in the past year, or that I was now managing major accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They didn't know that I had connections, resources, and a network of people who respected me. They didn't know a lot of things. I spent the weekend researching, making calls, and putting the pieces together. It turned out that Natalie's husband, Kyle, worked for a mid-sized marketing firm that had been trying to land a contract with Northrise Apparel for months. They'd submitted multiple proposals, but none of them had been accepted. Kyle didn't know that I was the one reviewing those proposals. I smiled to myself as I read through the latest submission. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. There were gaps in the strategy, missed opportunities, and a general lack of creativity. Normally, I would have passed on it without a second thought. But this time, I saw an opportunity. I decided to schedule a meeting with Kyle's team. I wanted to see him face to face, to watch him pitch his ideas while having no clue who I really was. It was risky, but it was also perfect. The meeting was set for the following week, and I spent the days leading up to it preparing. I reviewed every detail of their proposal, identified every weakness, and crafted a list of pointed questions that would expose the flaws in their strategy. When the day finally arrived, I walked into the conference room with confidence. Kyle and his team were already there, looking nervous and eager to impress. Kyle didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? We'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings, and I'd always been in the background, invisible. But when I introduced myself as the lead coordinator for the account they were pitching, his face went pale. "Carol," he stammered, his eyes wide. I smiled, extending my hand. "Nice to see you again, Kyle. Shall we get started?" The meeting was a disaster for them. I asked every hard question I'd prepared, and Kyle stumbled through his answers, clearly flustered. His team tried to cover for him, but it was obvious they weren't prepared. By the end of the meeting, I thanked them for their time and told them we'd be in touch. Kyle looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just nodded and left, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I felt a small flicker of satisfaction as I watched him go. This was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I continued to play my cards carefully. I didn't reject Kyle's proposal outright. Instead, I requested revisions, asked for additional meetings, and kept them on a string. I wanted them to work for it, to feel the pressure and the stress of not knowing whether they'd succeed or fail. And all the while, I waited for the perfect moment to make my next move. The tension was building, and I could feel it every time my phone buzzed with a new email from Kyle's team. They were desperate, sending me revised proposals and follow-up messages almost daily. I responded politely, professionally, giving them just enough encouragement to keep them hopeful without making any promises. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. I'd spent so many years being the one who had to beg for scraps of attention, the one who had to prove my worth over and over again. Now the tables were turned. Kyle was the one scrambling, and I was the one holding all the power. But I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. Eventually, I'd have to make a decision about the proposal. And when I did, it would send a message that Natalie and her family wouldn't forget. A week after the initial meeting, I received a text from Natalie. It was the first time she'd reached out to me since the dinner, and I was surprised to see her name pop up on my screen. "Hey Carol," the message read. "Can we talk?" I stared at the text for a long moment, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her wonder what I was thinking. But another part of me was curious. What did she want? I typed out a quick reply. "Sure. What's up?" Her response came almost immediately. "Can we meet for coffee? Tomorrow?" I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to see if she'd apologize. Maybe I wanted to confront her about what had happened at the dinner. Or maybe I just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized I wasn't the helpless little sister she thought I was. We met the next afternoon at a small cafe near my apartment. Natalie was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her phone and glancing around the room like she was waiting for someone else to show up. I sat down across from her, folding my hands on the table. "What did you want to talk about?" Natalie took a deep breath, avoiding my gaze. "I wanted to apologize. For the dinner. I didn't mean for it to go that far." I raised an eyebrow. "You told me to move because I wasn't blood family. In front of everyone. Then you stuck me with a $3,000 bill. What part of that wasn't intentional?" She flinched, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine regret in her eyes. But then she shook her head, and the defensiveness crept back in. "I was just joking," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't think you'd actually pay it." "Then why did you let me?" She didn't have an answer for that. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "You've spent your whole life treating me like I don't matter, Natalie. You and Mom and Dad. You've made it very clear that I'm not really part of this family. So why are you apologizing now?" She hesitated, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't apologizing because she felt bad. She was apologizing because she wanted something. "Kyle's been stressed," she finally admitted. "He told me about the meeting with your company. He didn't realize you were the one reviewing the proposal." There it was. I smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "So you're here to ask me to help him?" Natalie's cheeks flushed. "I'm asking you to be fair. He's worked really hard on this, and it would mean a lot to us if you gave his team a chance." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Be fair? That's rich coming from you." She looked down at her coffee, her hands gripping the cup tightly. "I know I've made mistakes, but Kyle doesn't deserve to suffer because of them." I leaned forward, my voice low. "You're right. Kyle doesn't deserve to suffer. But neither did I. And yet, here we are." Natalie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the laughter at the dinner table, the way she'd looked at me like I was nothing. The guilt faded. "I'll review the proposal fairly," I said, standing up. "But don't expect me to do you any favors." I left the cafe without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I'd just drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back now. As I walked home, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt powerful, in control for the first time in my life. But another part of me felt sad, like I was letting go of something I'd been holding on to for too long. That night, I made my decision. I was going to reject Kyle's proposal. Not because it was bad, but because I wanted Natalie to understand that actions have consequences. I wanted her to feel what it was like to lose something she cared about, the way I'd lost so much over the years. But as I sat at my desk, staring at the email I was about to send, I hesitated. Was this really who I wanted to be? Someone who used her power to hurt others, the way I'd been hurt? I closed my laptop and went to bed, the decision still weighing on my mind. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail from Janet. I didn't listen to it right away. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and got ready for work, letting the anticipation build. Finally, as I sat in my car in the parking garage, I hit play. "Carol, this is your mother," Janet's voice said, clipped and formal. "We need to talk. Call me back." I deleted the voicemail and drove to work, a small smile playing on my lips. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The call from Janet came again 2 days later, this time while I was in the middle of a meeting. I watched my phone buzz on the conference table, her name flashing across the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever she wanted, it could wait. When the meeting ended, I checked the message. Her voice was sharper this time, more insistent. "Carol, I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to call me back immediately. This is about family." Family. The word made me laugh. They only cared about family when they needed something from me. I decided to call her back during my lunch break, more out of curiosity than obligation. I sat in my car with a sandwich I'd picked up from a deli, took a bite, and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. "Carol, finally," she said, her voice tight. "What took you so long?" "I've been working, Janet. Some of us have jobs." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her jaw clenching on the other end of the line. "Don't be smart with me," she snapped. "I'm calling because Natalie is upset. She told me about your conversation at the cafe, and frankly, I'm disappointed in you." I took another bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly before responding. "Disappointed? That's interesting. What exactly am I supposed to have done wrong?" "You know what you did," she said. "Kyle's proposal is important to them, and you're deliberately sabotaging it because of some petty grudge." "Petty grudge?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call what happened at the restaurant? You all humiliated me, stuck me with a $3,000 bill, and now you're upset because I won't do Natalie a favor?" Janet sighed, the sound dripping with condescension. "You always were overly sensitive. We were just having a little fun. You should have laughed it off." "Fun," I said flatly. "Right. Well, I'm having fun now, too. This isn't a joke, Carol. Kyle needs this contract. If you reject it, it could hurt his career." I leaned back in my seat, staring out at the parking lot. "That's not my problem." "Carol, listen to me," Janet said, her voice softening in that fake, manipulative way she always used when she wanted something. "I know we've had our differences, but at the end of the day, we're family. Family helps each other. Don't you think you owe us something after everything we've done for you?" There it was. The guilt trip. The same one they'd been using on me my entire life. "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly. "You took me in when I was 4 because it made you look good. You gave me a roof over my head and food to eat, sure. But you never treated me like I was yours. You made me feel like an outsider every single day. So no, Janet, I don't think I owe you a damn thing." The line went silent for a moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end. "You're being selfish," she finally said, her voice cold. "I raised you better than this." "No, you didn't," I replied. "You barely raised me at all." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief, like I'd finally said something I'd been holding in for years. But I knew this wasn't over. That evening, I received a text from Howard. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk. Come to dinner this weekend." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to cut them off completely and move on with my life. But another part of me was curious. What were they planning? What did they think they could say to change my mind? I typed out a quick reply. I'll think about it. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the growing tension with my family. But it was hard to focus. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was Natalie or Janet or Howard, demanding something else from me. Kyle's proposal sat on my desk, untouched. I knew I needed to make a decision soon, but I kept putting it off. The longer I waited, the more anxious they'd become, and part of me enjoyed watching them squirm. On Friday afternoon, I finally opened the proposal again and read through it carefully. It was better than the first version they'd submitted, but it still had issues. The strategy was too generic, the budget was bloated, and the timeline was unrealistic. Under normal circumstances, I would have rejected it without hesitation. But these weren't normal circumstances. I picked up my phone and called Kyle's office, asking to speak with him directly. When he answered, his voice was tense. "Carol," he said, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I've reviewed your proposal," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I have some concerns." "Okay," he said slowly. "What kind of concerns?" I listed them off, one by one, watching as the silence on the other end grew heavier. When I finished, Kyle let out a long breath. "So you're rejecting it," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't say that," I replied. "I'm saying it needs work. If you want this contract, you're going to have to earn it." There was another pause, and then Kyle spoke again, his voice quieter. "Carol, I know things have been complicated between you and Natalie, but this is my career we're talking about. I'm asking you, as a professional, to give me a fair shot." I considered his words carefully. He was right. This was his career, and he hadn't done anything to me personally. But he'd also stood by while Natalie humiliated me at the dinner. He'd laughed along with the rest of them, like I was just a joke. "I am giving you a fair shot," I said. "But fair doesn't mean easy. You've got 2 weeks to revise the proposal. If it's not up to standard by then, I'm moving on to other options." Kyle exhaled sharply. "Understood. Thank you, Carol." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. I wasn't being cruel. I was being fair. If Kyle wanted to succeed, he'd have to work for it, just like I'd worked for everything I had. But I knew Natalie wouldn't see it that way. That weekend, I decided to skip the dinner Howard had invited me to. I sent him a polite text saying I was busy with work, which wasn't entirely a lie. I had plenty of projects to keep me occupied, and I didn't have the energy to deal with another round of guilt trips and manipulation. Instead, I spent Saturday catching up on errands and Sunday relaxing at home with a good book. It felt peaceful, quiet in a way my life hadn't been in weeks. But on Monday morning, everything changed. I arrived at work to find an email waiting for me from my boss, Gregory. The subject line read, "Urgent Family Matter." My stomach dropped as I opened it. "Carol, I received a call this morning from a woman named Janet who claims to be your mother. She expressed concerns about your handling of the Kyle Thompson account and suggested there may be a conflict of interest. I'd like to discuss this with you as soon as possible. Please come to my office when you get in." I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands trembling with rage. Janet had called my boss. She'd actually gone behind my back and tried to sabotage my career. I grabbed my phone and typed out a furious text to her. "How dare you call my boss? Stay out of my professional life." Her response came almost immediately. "You brought this on yourself. If you'd just helped Kyle like I asked, none of this would have happened." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I took a deep breath, deleted the text thread, and walked to Gregory's office. He was sitting at his desk when I knocked, and he gestured for me to come in. "Carol, sit down," he said, his tone neutral. I sat, folding my hands in my lap and trying to keep my composure. "I got a call from someone claiming to be your mother," Gregory began. "She said you're unfairly targeting a proposal from your brother-in-law's company because of a family dispute. Is there any truth to that?" I met his gaze steadily. "Kyle's proposal is being handled the same way I handle every other proposal. I've given him clear feedback and a chance to revise. There's no conflict of interest." Gregory studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's what I thought. I just wanted to hear it from you." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank you for trusting me." "Of course," he said. "But Carol, I have to ask, is this going to be a problem? If your family keeps interfering, it could become a distraction." I shook my head. "It won't be a problem. I'll handle it." Gregory seemed satisfied with that, and I left his office feeling both vindicated and furious. Janet had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That evening, I sat down at my laptop and started typing. I spent the next 2 days crafting a plan. Janet's phone call to my boss had been a wake-up call. She wasn't going to stop. None of them were. They thought they could push me around, manipulate me, and control my life the way they always had. But they were wrong. I started by gathering evidence. I went through old emails, text messages, and even dug up some photos from family events over the years. I wanted a clear record of how they'd treated me, not because I planned to take legal action, but because I wanted to be prepared for whatever they threw at me next. As I scrolled through the messages, I found something that made me pause. It was an email from Janet to Howard, sent about 5 years ago. I'd never seen it before, but somehow it had ended up in my inbox, probably forwarded by accident. The subject line read, "Carol's college fund." I opened it, my heart pounding. "Howard, I think we should use Carol's college fund for Natalie's wedding. Carol got scholarships anyway, so she doesn't really need it. Besides, it's not like she'll ever know. We can just tell her we spent it on household expenses if she asks." I read the email 3 times, each time feeling a fresh wave of anger. They'd taken my college fund, the money my biological parents had left for me, the money that was supposed to help me build a future, and they'd spent it on Natalie's wedding. I remembered that wedding. It had been extravagant, with a live band, an open bar, and a guest list of over 200 people. At the time, I'd wondered how they could afford it, but I'd never asked. I'd just assumed they'd saved up or taken out a loan. Now I knew the truth. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This changed everything. They hadn't just treated me poorly, they'd stolen from me. I forwarded the email to myself from multiple accounts, making sure I had backups, and then I started researching. I needed to know if there was anything I could do about it legally. It turned out there was. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer the following week, bringing the email and any other documentation I had. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, listened to my story without interruption, taking notes as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded. "You have a case. If that money was held in trust for you, they had no legal right to use it for anything else. You could sue for the full amount, plus interest." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. Patricia did some quick calculations. "Based on what you've told me, probably somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $70,000. I felt my breath catch. That was a significant amount of money that could have helped me pay off student loans or put a down payment on a house. "What are my options?" I asked. "You can file a lawsuit," Patricia said, "but that's going to be expensive and time-consuming. Alternatively, you could confront them directly and demand repayment. If they refuse, then you file." I thanked her and left the office, my mind spinning. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go through the hassle of a lawsuit, but I knew I couldn't let this go. That night, I drafted an email to Janet and Howard. I kept it short and to the point. I know about the college fund. You stole from me, and I want it back. If you don't repay me within 30 days, I'll be taking legal action. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then closed my laptop and went to bed. The response came the next morning. How dare you accuse us of theft? That money was used for family expenses, which includes you. You're being ungrateful and ridiculous. We're not giving you a cent. I forwarded the email to Patricia with a single line. Let's file. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. Patricia filed the lawsuit, and Janet and Howard were served with the papers. I didn't hear from them directly, but I knew they were panicking. Natalie called me multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading, but I didn't respond. At work, Kyle submitted his revised proposal. I reviewed it carefully, and to my surprise, it was actually good. He'd addressed all my concerns, streamlined the budget, and come up with some creative ideas that I hadn't expected. Part of me wanted to reject it anyway, just to prove a point. But I couldn't. It wouldn't be fair, and more importantly, it wouldn't be professional. I approved the proposal and sent Kyle an email congratulating him. I didn't mention Natalie or the lawsuit or anything personal. I just kept it simple and professional. Kyle's response was equally professional, but I could sense the relief in his words. Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate the opportunity. I felt a strange sense of closure as I read his email. This chapter was over, at least as far as work was concerned. But the lawsuit was just beginning. A few days later, I received a call from Patricia. They want to settle, she said. They're offering $50,000. I thought about it for a moment. $50,000 was less than what I was owed, but it was still a significant amount. And more importantly, it meant I wouldn't have to go through a lengthy trial. Tell them I want $60,000, I said. That's my final offer. Patricia called me back an hour later. They agreed. I felt a rush of satisfaction. They were going to pay, literally and figuratively. But the best part came a week later, when I received a frantic call from Natalie. Carol, please, she said, her voice breaking. Mom and Dad are selling the house. They can't afford to keep it after paying you. Can't you just let this go? I paused, letting her words sink in. They were selling the house they'd raised Natalie in, the house where she'd had all her birthday parties and family dinners, the house that had never really felt like home to me. No, I said simply. I can't. Carol, please, she begged. This is tearing the family apart. Good, I replied. Maybe you'll finally understand how I've felt my entire life. I hung up, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. The settlement came through 2 weeks later. $60,000, deposited directly into my account. I stared at the balance on my phone, hardly believing it was real. For so long, I'd felt powerless, like I had no control over my own life. But now, I had proof that I could fight back and win. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone except Patricia, who congratulated me and closed the case. Instead, I sat quietly in my apartment, thinking about what to do next. The money was mine, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. I could pay off my student loans, invest it, or even take a trip somewhere I'd always wanted to go. But first, I wanted to do something that felt meaningful. I decided to donate $10,000 to a local organization that helped foster children transition into adulthood. I'd always felt a connection to kids in the system, knowing how easy it was to fall through the cracks. If I could make a difference for even one person, it would be worth it. The rest of the money, I put toward a down payment on a small house. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom place on the outskirts of Portland. But it was mine. No one could take it away from me, and no one could make me feel like I didn't belong there. As I signed the paperwork, I felt a sense of accomplishment I'd never experienced before. This was my life, built on my own terms, and I was finally free. But freedom came with consequences. A few days after I moved into the house, I received an email from Natalie. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and scanned the message. "Carol, I know you're angry, and I understand why. But what you've done has destroyed our family. Mom and Dad are devastated. They had to sell the house and move into a small apartment. They're struggling financially, and it's all because of you. I don't know if you care, but I thought you should know." I read the email twice, waiting for the guilt to set in. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt nothing. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences, just like I'd lived with the consequences of their choices my entire life. I closed the email and didn't respond. Over the next few weeks, I focused on settling into my new home. I painted the walls, bought furniture, and made it a space that felt warm and welcoming. For the first time in my life, I had a place that was truly mine, and it felt incredible. Work was going well too. Gregory had been impressed with how I'd handled the situation with Kyle, and he'd started giving me more responsibility. I was managing bigger accounts, leading more meetings, and earning the respect of my colleagues. One afternoon, as I was finishing up a project, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, but something told me to pick up. "Hello?" "Carol, it's Howard." I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. "What do you want?" "I want to talk," he said, his voice subdued. "Can we meet? Just you and me." I considered hanging up, but something in his tone made me pause. He sounded different, not angry or demanding, but almost defeated. "Why?" I asked. "Because I owe you an apology," he said, "and I want to make things right." I didn't believe him, but I was curious enough to agree. We met at a coffee shop near my office the next day. Howard was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table in the corner. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer and his face lined with worry. I sat down across from him, crossing my arms. "You have 5 minutes." Howard took a deep breath. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, Carol. We all have. And I know an apology won't fix what we've done. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. "What brought this on?" "Losing the house," he admitted. "It made me realize how much we've taken for granted. Janet and I have been so focused on Natalie that we forgot about you, and that was wrong." "You didn't forget about me," I said quietly. "You just didn't care." Howard flinched, but he didn't argue. "You're right, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what we did to you, and I'm ashamed." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that maybe things could be different. But I knew better. People didn't change overnight, and words didn't erase years of pain. "I appreciate the apology," I said, standing up, "but it doesn't change anything." Howard nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand." As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. I didn't need his apology to move on. I'd already done that on my own. But the real turning point came a few weeks later, when I ran into Natalie at a grocery store. She was standing in the produce section, looking tired and worn down. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might turn and walk away. Instead, she approached me, her expression uncertain. "Carol," she said softly, "can we talk?" I looked at her, taking in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders sagged. She looked nothing like the confident, smug woman who'd humiliated me at the restaurant. "What do you want, Natalie?" "I want to apologize," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For the dinner, for the way I've treated you. For all of it." I studied her face, searching for any sign that this was another manipulation. but all I saw was exhaustion and regret. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I've lost everything," she admitted. "Kyle and I are getting a divorce. He blames me for the stress with the proposal, and honestly, I don't blame him. I've been terrible to you, and it's caught up with me." I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger. "You're only apologizing because your life fell apart, not because you actually feel bad." "That's not true," Natalie said, tears streaming down her face. "I do feel bad. I've always felt bad. But I didn't know how to fix it." I took a step back, shaking my head. "It's too late, Natalie. You made your choices and now you have to live with them." I walked away, leaving her standing there, and I didn't look back. 3 months passed, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. My new house became a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe without the weight of my family's expectations crushing me. I spent my evenings reading on the porch, tending to a small garden I'd started in the backyard, and occasionally inviting coworkers over for dinner. Work continued to thrive. Gregory promoted me to senior coordinator, which came with a significant raise and more autonomy over my projects. I was managing accounts worth over $500,000 now, and my opinion carried weight in the company. It felt good to be valued, to be seen as competent and reliable. But despite all the progress I'd made, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The lawsuit had been settled, the apologies had been given, and I'd made it clear I wanted nothing to do with my family. Yet there was still a hollow space inside me, a need for something more concrete, more final. That's when I received an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Diane, who introduced herself as a social worker with the Oregon Department of Human Services. She said she'd been trying to locate me for several weeks and had finally gotten my contact information through my employer. "I'm reaching out regarding your biological parents' estate," the email read. "There are some documents that require your signature, and we'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the details. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." I stared at the email, my heart pounding. My biological parents had died when I was 4, and I'd always assumed there was nothing left of their estate. Janet and Howard had never mentioned anything about it, and I'd been too young to ask questions. I called Diane the next day, and we arranged to meet at her office downtown. When I arrived, she greeted me warmly and led me to a small conference room where a stack of papers sat waiting on the table. "Thank you for coming," Diane said, sitting down across from me. "I know this must be overwhelming, but I wanted to explain what we've discovered." She slid a folder across the table, and I opened it cautiously. Inside were documents related to a trust fund that had been set up by my biological parents before their death. According to the paperwork, the trust was supposed to be managed by Janet and Howard until I turned 18, at which point it would be transferred to me. But it had never been transferred. "Your adoptive parents were supposed to notify you when you became an adult," Diane explained, "but it appears they never did. We only discovered this because we were conducting an audit of old estate cases." I felt my hands start to shake as I flipped through the documents. The trust had grown significantly over the years, compounded interest turning the original $50,000 into nearly $130,000. "This is mine?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diane nodded. "Yes. It should have been released to you when you turned 18, but since it wasn't, it's been sitting in the account all this time. With interest, it's worth quite a bit now." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Janet and Howard had known about this money. They'd known it was mine, and they'd kept it from me for nearly a decade. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Just sign these forms, and we'll initiate the transfer," Diane said. "The money should be in your account within a few weeks." I signed the papers with trembling hands, barely able to believe what was happening. When I left the office, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the paperwork in my lap. They'd taken everything from me. My childhood, my sense of belonging, and now I knew they'd taken my money too. But unlike the college fund, this time they wouldn't get away with it. I called Patricia, my lawyer, as soon as I got home. "I need to file another lawsuit," I said, explaining what I'd just learned. Patricia listened carefully, asking questions and taking notes. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. "This is fraud," she said. "And it's a lot more serious than the college fund situation. If they knowingly withheld this money from you, they could face criminal charges." "I want to pursue it," I said firmly. "All of it." "Are you sure?" Patricia asked. "This is going to get ugly, Carol. They're not going to take this lying down." "I'm sure," I said. "They've taken enough from me. It's time they paid for it." Over the next few weeks, Patricia worked on building the case. We gathered evidence, reviewed the trust documents, and prepared for what would likely be a long legal battle. But I didn't care how long it took. I was done letting them get away with treating me like I didn't matter. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, I'd received over 20 missed calls from Janet, Howard, and Natalie. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I blocked their numbers and focused on moving forward. But the calls didn't stop. They started showing up at my house, banging on the door and demanding to talk to me. I called the police the first time it happened, and they were escorted off my property. The second time, I filed for a restraining order. The restraining order was granted within a week, and suddenly, the harassment stopped. They couldn't contact me, couldn't come near my house, and couldn't interfere with my life anymore. For the first time in months, I felt truly safe. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I received an email from Natalie. She'd created a new email address to get around the restraining order, and the message was long and rambling. "Carol, I don't know what else to do," it read. "Mom and Dad are falling apart. They're drowning in legal fees, and now with this new lawsuit, they're talking about filing for bankruptcy. I know you're angry, but please, can't you just let this go? They're sorry. We're all sorry. Please, just stop." I read the email twice, then deleted it without responding. I wasn't going to let guilt manipulate me anymore. A few weeks later, Patricia called with an update. "They're offering to settle," she said. "They're willing to pay the full amount of the trust, plus an additional $50,000 for emotional distress." I did the math in my head. That was nearly $200,000 total. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think it's a good offer," Patricia said. "But it's your decision." I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to drag them through court, to make them suffer the way I'd suffered, but another part of me just wanted it to be over. "I'll take the settlement," I said, but I wanted in writing that they're admitting fault. "Done," Patricia said. The settlement was finalized a month later, and the money was deposited into my account. I stared at the balance, hardly able to believe it was real. I'd gone from feeling like I had nothing to having more money than I'd ever imagined. But the money wasn't the point. The point was that I'd stood up for myself, and I'd won. The months following the settlement were transformative. I paid off my student loans completely, invested a portion of the money, and set aside a fund for future expenses. But more importantly, I started thinking about what I really wanted out of life. For so long, I'd been focused on survival, on proving that I could make it on my own. But now that I had, I realized I wanted more than just financial security. I wanted purpose. I started volunteering at the organization I donated to months earlier, the one that helped foster children. I worked with teenagers who were aging out of the system, helping them navigate job applications, college admissions, and basic life skills. It was rewarding in a way I'd never experienced before. These kids reminded me of myself, overlooked, underestimated, and desperate for someone to believe in them. And I wanted to be that person for them. One afternoon, I was working with a 17-year-old girl named Sophie, who was preparing for college. She was smart and driven, but she was terrified of failing. "What if I'm not good enough?" she asked, her voice small. I looked at her and saw myself at that age, full of doubt and fear. "You are good enough," I said firmly. "And even if you stumble, you'll get back up. That's what makes you strong." Sophie smiled, and in that moment, I realized that this was what I'd been searching for. Not revenge, not validation, but the chance to make a difference. Work continued to go well, and I found myself mentoring younger employees at Northrise Apparel. Gregory noticed and started giving me opportunities to lead training sessions and workshops. I loved it. The feeling of helping others grow and succeed. But despite all the positive changes, there was still one thing I couldn't shake: the silence from my family. I hadn't heard from them since the settlement, and part of me wondered if they'd finally given up. But another part of me knew better. People like Janet and Natalie didn't give up that easily. My suspicions were confirmed when I received a letter in the mail one Saturday afternoon. It was from Natalie, written on expensive stationery in her perfect looping handwriting. "Dear Carol," it began. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. I've spent the past few months reflecting on everything that's happened, and I realize now how wrong I was. Not just about the dinner or the money, but about everything. I treated you like you didn't matter, and I'm ashamed of that. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. I've started therapy, and I'm working on understanding why I acted the way I did. I hope that someday we can find a way to be sisters again. Love, Natalie." I read the letter several times, trying to decide how I felt. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe she really had changed. But the wounds were too deep, the scars too fresh. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, unsure what to do with it. A few days later, I ran into Kyle at a coffee shop downtown. He was sitting alone at a table, staring at his laptop with a look of intense concentration. When he saw me, he stood up and waved me over. "Carol," he said, his voice warm. "It's good to see you." I hesitated, then walked over to his table. "Hi, Kyle. How are you?" "I'm good," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. "Actually, I've been meaning to reach out to you. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" I asked, confused. "For approving the proposal," he said. "I know things were complicated, and I wasn't sure if you would. But you did, and it's made a huge difference for my career." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of pride. "You earned it." The revised proposal was solid. Kyle nodded, then looked down at his coffee. "I also wanted to apologize for the dinner. I should have said something, should have stood up for you, but I didn't, and I'm sorry." I studied his face, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. "I appreciate that," I said. "It means a lot." We talked for a while longer, and by the time I left, I felt a small sense of closure. Kyle wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was more than I could say for the rest of my family. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself thinking less and less about Janet, Howard, and Natalie. They were still out there, living their lives, but they were no longer a part of mine, and that was exactly how I wanted it. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I received a text from an unknown number. "Carol, it's Howard. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to let you know that Janet and I are getting a divorce. I thought you should know. Take care." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me felt vindicated, like their downfall was proof that karma was real. But another part of me just felt sad. They'd built their entire lives around maintaining an image, and now that image had crumbled. They'd lost their house, their money, and now their marriage. And while I didn't feel guilty about it, I didn't feel triumphant either. I deleted the message and went back to watching the sunset, letting the last remnants of my old life fade into the background. A year after the settlement, I received an invitation to speak at a fundraising event for the foster care organization I'd been volunteering with. They wanted me to share my story, to talk about overcoming adversity and finding success despite a difficult start. I was nervous about it at first. I'd never been comfortable sharing personal details with strangers, and the idea of standing in front of a room full of people made my stomach churn. But the organizer, a woman named Claire, assured me that my story could make a real difference. "People need to hear this," she said. "They need to know that it's possible to rise above a toxic family and build a life you're proud of." I agreed, and on the night of the event, I stood at the podium in front of over 200 people, my hands shaking as I gripped the microphone. I told them about being adopted, about feeling like an outsider in my own home. I told them about the dinner, the bill, and the moment I decided I was done being treated like I didn't matter. And then I told them about the lawsuits, the settlements, and the money I'd reclaimed. I told them about the house I'd bought, the career I'd built, and the kids I was now helping through the same struggles I'd faced. By the time I finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause was thunderous, and as I stepped down from the podium, several people approached me to share their own stories. Some had been adopted, some had been in foster care, and some had just struggled with feeling like they didn't belong. But they all had one thing in common: they'd survived. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of peace I'd never experienced before. I'd turned my pain into purpose, and in doing so, I'd found something far more valuable than revenge. I'd found myself. A few weeks later, I received a final email from Natalie. It was short, just a few lines. "Carol, I saw the video of your speech online. I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but I am. You're an amazing person, and I'm sorry I never saw it before. I hope you're happy." I read the email, then closed my laptop without responding. I didn't need her approval or her pride. I'd built my life without her, and I was going to keep living it on my own terms. But as I sat there, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had fueled me for so long had faded, replaced by something quieter and more sustainable: contentment. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, standing in that restaurant with a $3,000 bill in front of me. I thought about how humiliated I'd felt, how small and powerless. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I'd fought back, not with cruelty or vengeance, but with strength and determination. I'd reclaimed what was mine, built a life I was proud of, and found a way to help others do the same. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Janet and Howard had both moved to a small town in eastern Oregon, far away from the life they'd once known. They were living in separate apartments, working part-time jobs and struggling to make ends meet. Natalie had moved back in with Janet temporarily after her divorce was finalized, but the relationship was strained. She'd lost her job due to the stress, and was working as a receptionist at a dental office, barely scraping by. Kyle, on the other hand, had thrived. The contract with Northrise Apparel had opened doors for him, and he'd started his own consulting firm. We'd stayed in touch professionally, exchanging occasional emails about industry trends and opportunities. As for me, I continued volunteering, working, and building the life I'd always wanted. I adopted a dog, a rescue named Biscuit, who had the same scrappy determination I'd developed over the years. I traveled to places I'd only dreamed of visiting, and I learned, slowly but surely, to trust people again. I never reconciled with my adoptive family. There were no tearful reunions, no heartfelt apologies that changed everything. And I was okay with that, because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to destroy the people who hurt you. It's to build something so beautiful, so strong, so undeniably yours that their opinions stop mattering. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching Biscuit chase butterflies in the yard, I thought about the journey I'd been on. The pain, the anger, the settlements, and the speeches. All of it had led me here, to this quiet moment of peace. I'd set out for revenge, but what I'd found was so much better. I'd found freedom.